Hello everyone, welcome to video number 9 of Java Fundamentals. In this video, we're going to learn about methods. So first of all, what are methods useful for? Well, one of the biggest uses of methods is if you have a function in your code that you want to repeat over and over again, but you don't want to write it down too many times, well, methods, they allow you to write it down just once, and then you can use it as many times as you want. So overall, it just makes your code a lot shorter and cleaner. And there are some other uses of methods as well, but this is one of the biggest. So how do you create a method? Well, you need to create it outside of this right over here, but make sure it's still inside of class main. So just press enter right over here and then write public static. And if you're going to learn AP Computer Science A after this course, you'll learn what public and static mean. But for this course, you don't need to know what they mean. And for this course, all methods will begin with public and static. All right, and after static, write down the return type. If you don't want your method to return anything, just write down void. And we're going to start with void methods. And then later in this video, we'll learn about methods that do return values. All right, and then afterwards, give your method a name. You can call it whatever you want. Let's just call it act, parentheses, and inside these parentheses, put your parameters. And you can have as many parameters as you want. If you don't want any parameters, then just leave these two parentheses empty. And to put down parameters, you first put a variable type such as int, all right, and then the name of the parameter. And if you want more than one parameter, just separate each of your parameters with a comma. All right, and then curly brackets, and then write the code for your method inside. So I'm just going to write down a piece of code. All right, so I've written down this code, and to call your method, just write the name of the method, parentheses, and then your parameters. So you can make it 2,7, for example. And what this does is it makes 2 the value of A for this method, and it makes 7 the value for B. So therefore, if we were to run this, then it should print out the first number is 2 and the second number is 7. So let's run this and then see what happens. All right, it does indeed print that out. And there is a special statement that you could use for methods. So that statement is return. So I'm going to show you what that means in a second. All right, so just type return and then semicolon. All right, and what return does is it stops your method immediately. So therefore your code will not run anything that happens after the return statement, and then it just exits out of this method. So let's write down another statement underneath here. All right, so what this does is if A is equal to 2, then it returns. So therefore, it stops this method immediately and it doesn't get to this statement right over here. But if A is not equal to 2, then we ignore this if statement and then we get to this code right over here. So it prints out the first number is not 2. So in this case, A is equal to 2. So therefore, it should not print this statement out. And indeed, it doesn't. All right, let's run this method again using different parameters. All right, and then let's run this. All right, so for the first time we called this method, it printed this out. And then the second time, it printed this out. And that's exactly what we expected. Now we are getting into value returning methods. So I'm going to erase this code right over here. All right, and let's change the return type and name of the method. So for the return type, you can make it any variable type, or you can make it an array or array list. And for this video, we're just going to be using int as the return type for all the methods. And then let's give this method a name. We'll call it product. And then parameters, int a, int b. So with this method, we want to return the product of a and b. And see how it's underlined in red right here? That's because it says the method must return a result of type int. We don't have any return statement in this method so far, so that's why it's underlined in red. All right, so to make a return statement, we type return space and then a value. So we want to return a times b. So this return statement serves two functions. One, it exits out of this method immediately, just like the previous return statement that we saw for the void method. And two, it returns this value here. All right, so to call this method, we can do system.out.println product, and the parameters. All right, so this right over here, because we're returning the product, it should return 21. So therefore, if we print it out, it should print 21. So let's run this. And indeed, it does print out 21. Now, let's try something else. Can we modify variables using methods? So I'm going to initialize a variable right here. All right, and then let's make it so let's do a equals 5 right here. All right, so before we do that, let's first print out a inside the method, and then let's print out a after we set it to 5. All right, now I'm going to put x as the parameter. So therefore the parameter begins as 3. And then later we do a equals 5. So that means that the parameter changes to 5. All right, and then let's see if a equals 5 modifies x. So I'm just going to print out x at the end. All right, let's see what this prints. All right, so it first prints out 3. That's this statement right over here because we passed 3 as a parameter for a, and then it sets a to 5. So therefore this parameter right over here is changed, and then it prints out 5. And then for this print statement right over here, so we've already set a equal to 5. So even though we originally passed 3 as a parameter, this method right over here changed it to 5. So it returned 5 times 7, which is 35. So that's why this statement right over here printed 35. And then in the end, we printed out x and it printed out 3. So even though we changed the value of a in this inside this method, it did not change the value of x, even though we passed it as a parameter. So you cannot modify variables with a method. You can only modify parameters. But is it possible to modify a variable with a method? All right, so before we get into that, let's talk about passing an array as a parameter. So I'm going to make an array. We'll just call it ARR, and then I'll give it the values 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. All right, and then let's change this method right over here. So I'm going to change it to act. And then to pass an array as a parameter, you type the type of the array, so int, and then 2 brackets to signify that it's an array. All right, and then give the parameter a name. So let's right over here, before we call the method, let's just print out all the elements of the array. And then let's call this method. with the array we created as the parameter. All right, and inside this method, let's just set the element at index 2 to 10. All right, and then now let's print out all the elements of the array again. All right, and then make sure we change this to void. Now let's run this. All right, so the first time it printed out 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then after running the method, it printed out 1, 2, 10, 4, 5. So that means that we are able to change the value of elements of an array using methods. So even though we cannot change just variables, we can change arrays with methods. So therefore, if you want to just be able to change the value of a variable using a method, here, let me just go back a while in my code to where I created that variable. All right, so we're at this point in the code and we found out that we cannot change the value of x, but what about instead we make x an array of length 1. So an array of length 1 is basically the same thing as a variable. All right, and then make sure we set the first element to 3. All right, and then let's change this up a little bit. So make sure you change this to an array as a parameter. All right, and then right here, let's make sure we print out, we modify this code because we just changed x and a to arrays. So let's just change every appearance of a with a0 and every appearance of x with x0. All right, let's run this. All right, so it printed out 3, 5, 35, and this time it printed out 5. So therefore, this is how you can modify variables using a method. Just change the variable to, instead of being a variable, change it to an array of length 1. And then you can modify it using methods. So before we get into the optional exercise, I'm going to show you another example of a method. So suppose we want to create a method that returns the lowest of 2 numbers. All right. So in that case, let's make sure we change this up. Let's call it lowest, and then take 2 integers as parameters. All right, in that case, so basically, if a is less than b, we want to return a. Otherwise, we want to return b. So we can do if a is less than b, then return a. And then if we haven't returned anything yet, then return b. All right, so now let's just call this method. All right, and then let's run this. All right, so it prints out -2. Here is the optional exercise. Write a method that takes an a and a digit b as parameters and returns the number of times b appears inside of a. So here's an example. If a is this number right over here and b is 5, you see that 5 appears 2 times inside of a. So therefore, this method should return 2. So if you want to give this problem a try, then pause the video here and keep watching for the solution. Here is the solution. So first, let's create the method, public static, and we want it to return an int. And then let's call it whatever we want. I'll just say count. All right, we take int a and int b as parameters. All right, the first thing we need is a counter. This counts the number of appearances of B inside of A. All right, and now you can use an integer mod 10 to determine the last digit in that integer. And you can use an integer slash equals 10 to get rid of the last digit of an integer. So with that information, we can iterate through every digit of A. So let's use a while statement, and I'll put the condition later. So if the last digit of A, so A mod 10 is equal to B, then we increase the counter by 1. And then after this, we divide A by 10 to get rid of the last digit. All right, so now the condition should be while A is greater than 0, because once A is 0, that means we've iterated through every digit of A. All right, and then at the end, we want to return counter. All right, and now let's call this method. All right, and then I'll use the example I showed earlier as the parameters. So let's run this. All right, it prints out 2, which is the correct answer. All right, in this video, you learned about methods. And if you want more practice, in the description, there is a link to a page with 16 exercises and their solutions, so you can go ahead and check that out. And you've just completed the second to last video of Java fundamentals. So I'll see you in video 10 of 10 and possibly AP Computer Science A afterwards.